clap or something to
Yeah,
sync it?
yeah.
Are you recording? Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here on the occasion of Justin Balmain's solo exhibition for Gertrude Glasshouse. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathering today on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. My name's Mark Feary. Hello group. Artistic Director of Gertrude Contemporary. Justin, as many of you would know, Glasshouse is the principal vehicle for the new solo exhibitions by artists participating in the 2-year studio program at Gertrude. It's been a very, as you might imagine, very strange couple of years, and it means that everyone is in the studios for much longer than 2 years. Some of these ideas of duration and pandemic will come out across the course of this discussion, but it is great for you to all be here with us. Justin.
My name's Justin Balmain. I'm in my second year now of the residency of the studio program. With lots of sort of like breaks and hiccups in between. So I guess in terms of like a timeline, I'm in my second year, but I feel like I've sort of just started somewhat in a weird kind of way. But yes, Mark and Tracy offered me this show about this time last year.
Yeah.
Which is sort of normally, from what I understand, a little bit sort of earlier than studio artists will take up their exhibition at Glasshouse. And I thought that the opportunity to exhibit earlier would sort of work really well for me, just because at that time I had a project underway, and I felt quite confident that in that sort of 7 to 8 month period I could have resolved that project for this show. But also I know the way that I work, that sort of my 2-year/3-year studio program sort of would have really been about this Glasshouse show. So in a way this was like an opportunity to kind of take that pressure off and use the rest of my residency in just in a different way, I guess, to how I might have, understood my methodology pushing me towards that final penultimate exhibition. Yeah, so for that, this has been, a really good opportunity for me, and I didn't end up including the work that I was intending to make for this show, but I think that it's been an opportunity for me just to kind of like experiment with ideas, new forms, be a little bit sort of experimental, and also like not as I guess like reliant on this final kind of exhibition.
Yeah. To put Justin's practice into a little bit of context as well. So Justin is brought up in Sydney, and where he lived and practiced for most of his life, and has come to Melbourne probably about 3 years ago.
Yeah,
3 years
close
ago.
to, yeah.
After spending a number of years based in New York. So in some ways his practice is quite new to Melbourne audiences, and I knew, when I lived in Sydney, knew Justin's practice, and invited him when I started at Gertrude to show an existing work which I thought was really striking, in the Octopus of 2016, which was a show called Antiques Roadshow, which was in some ways about how artists were of a kind of a younger generation were kind of interested in and very conscious of the obsolescence of technologies. In some ways, the show kind of pulled out these kind of nostalgic tropes and methodologies for you know, the kind of quite rampant changes in technologies. And but I won't speak too much about that project. But this, you know, for me, when we asked Justin to do this show and we spoke about it, you know, some months later, and I was really struck by the idea that Justin had, and thought it's, you know, a kind of a great all-in project, a great all-in gesture. And if it wasn't able to work, you know, that he would really, it would be, you know, it was backing a certain kind of idea. And at that time he was talking about that there would be a film that might accompany it. But in, you know, the thing that I really took from that initial proposal was the idea of looking at the, you know, the structure of the gallery, the structure of Glasshouse, and wanting to invert the lighting setup, which, you know, of course sounds like you know, it's a really simple idea. And, you know, after consulting an electrician who said, you know, it was kind of feasible as a project idea. But I think, you know, in many ways, some of the best art is about kind of a really simple idea executed well in some ways. And I think it's such a great project for, you know, Justin and I, when we were speaking the other day, we're talking about how kind of droll in some ways the idea of, you know, interrogating an architecture kind of is, and how, you know, mostly it doesn't kind of interrogate the architecture. But, you know, and I'm not suggesting that this work, I mean, it does bring the kind of it reveals something of the architecture, it reveals something of the neutral structure of the space, and kind of deneutralizes it in some ways.
And I think it was what I was sort of almost hoping along the way was that because on some levels, yeah, it's quite simple, but it's also the act of doing it is somewhat kind of like ambitious and destructive and all these potential things. So there was always this hope that at any point in time it was just going to get shut down. Like, okay, like let's talk to Mark about this. Hopefully Mark's going to shut it down. And you know, Mark's in, and then it's like, okay, then the electrician's going to shut it down. It's going to be too hard for the electrician, and then the electrician is all on board, and then, you know, Ian and the team, they're all on board. So I feel like at various moments, you know, like I kind of wanted it not to happen for practical reasons.
Which in some ways actually did happen, because we finished installing the show on I think it was a Wednesday afternoon or Thursday. Wednesday afternoon it must have been. Anyway, we got put into lockdown that night for a week, which turned out to be like 3 months.
3 months.
But yeah, so in some ways it did kind of get shut down. So that, I mean, that was a really interesting thing that I hadn't clued into initially, that the title of the show, 31 Days Without Light, is a reference in twofold reference. One being a reference to a work that Justin's working on at the moment, a film work called 3 Days Without Light. And the 31 days was would have been at that early stage the duration of this particular show. So it's about the idea of how long the light fittings wouldn't be attached to the ceiling. So ultimately, with the lockdown, it's been you know, probably close on 100 days without light.
99, I think, was the.
99.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and I you know, I think that the idea of the video, you know, when I, you know, often, well, preferably when I show video work, I tend to really be interested in the space where I'm exhibiting it, and I like to, you know, whether it's alter that space in some way or work very sort of intently within that architecture, like that becomes really important. And I think that the more time that I spent in this space, and also like other things sort of started to happen around the film that I was making around various lockdowns. So the production of the work started to become halted. So the reality of making the work became a lot further, became, you know, much more unrealistic. But also the more time that I spent in this space, the more I felt that I would just be negating the gallery space by bringing like a video work or a projection, you know, into this environment. You know, and I've seen video work in here that works really well, but I think just for the way that I like to install video work as a sort of an installation, not necessarily a site-specific response, but something that very much kind of considers what's happening within the environment. I just couldn't see that working for my project. So in a way, I guess this kind of becomes a sort of a way to sort of to still like think about and work within the architecture in a very specific way, but not necessarily through like a video installation.
Would this be the first time you've worked not in film in a way?
No. It's the first time in a while I haven't worked in video, but no.
So what is the relationship between this project and the film? So Justin's working on this film, it has been for some time, and is literally kind of shooting at the moment.
Yeah. So the relationship, I think, is quite sort of tangential in a way. I think that when I made the decision to move away from exhibiting a video work for this exhibition, and sort of starting to think about like new ways of working in the space, like as an exhibition outcome, I think in many ways I wanted to sort of almost create, you know, like an idea of or a memory of the video that sort of hadn't happened yet in a way. So one of the ways of doing that is through, you know, the LED signage, for example. Yeah. So that will become prominent in the video work. So at some point, you know, when the video is finished, there's like a formal element in that work that sort of harks back to this exhibition. But it's, you know, it's definitely not a sort of a literal relationship between this exhibition and the video.
Yeah. Even in its titling, were you thinking as that way of kind of, in the relationship of the titles, was that a way of, when you were thinking of the title for this, were you thinking about this show including the video, and that was its kind of relationship in some ways?
Not at the beginning. I've known for a while that the title of the video work would be 3 Days Without Light. Yeah. So I think that when I was trying to sort of come up with a title for this show, and I was trying to like, you know, bring that relationship together a little bit closer, that's when the kind of the relationship through the titling sort of made sense. Yeah. But that's sort of really the only connection to the title.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this all, in some ways, then kind of is unrelated, but in some ways, kind of foregrounds through the motif of the sign out the front.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I think was such a great thing to, you know, and this maybe this kind of harks back to this idea of the, you know, kind of lack of humour and the kind of earnestness, or you know, faux seriousness about, you know, architectural interrogation.
Yeah.
You know, for me, the sign brings such a kind of, you know, kind of sense of whimsy and kind of humour, which, you know, I think is kind of really additive in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really, with the sign, I really wanted it to, you know, sort of point to, you know, I guess, you know, like an aura of what these spaces can represent. Yeah. You know, that it sort of, it points to a, I mean, I guess for me, I sort of keep coming back to the word magic, which is in the sign, but this magic of, you know, what an artwork can do, and also like what, I guess, the viewer, that sort of, I guess like almost the contract that we enter when we enter into an art space.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, for me, there's sort of this, an aura or a layer of magic that exists with that. And I think, you know, I really wanted the sign to kind of like point to that, so that this didn't just become a, you know, a very rigid, formal structure, which it is. But I wanted the sign to sort of, I guess, like kind of neutralize that a little bit, or like counter that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that way, and we were talking about this the other day, that it's, in some ways, by being a thought bubble, it's kind of more, you know, it's more playful as an utterance, and kind of less definitive in some ways, as having a kind of rectangular sign would have been.
Yeah.
You know, I think it gives, you know, I think it adds this, you know, sense of kind of intimacy, and also a sort of a sense of it, of kind of not being entirely sure.
Yeah.
You know, something that's kind of thought without pronounced.
Yeah. Well, I think a sign, you know, especially if it's quite rigid, and what we might know as a, you know, kind of shop signage, for example, they tend to be telling us something, giving us some sort of information, whether it's like the name of the store or direction. So I think the thought bubble sort of design, it's less about providing direct information, and more about just sort of presenting an idea.
Yeah. So this project and the film have a relation to a museum in Marseille, and some kind of research that you've been doing there, and I imagine in some sort of ongoing way off-site.
Yeah. So I entered a partnership with an ethnographic museum in Marseille called the Museum, and the Museum's quite a new ethnographic museum, and one of the items within their collection that I started to research, and then through the partnership was able to go there and spend time within the museum, is a haunted black mirror. And the thing that's like really interesting about this particular object is that it's sort of like acknowledged and treated as haunted by the institution itself. So the way that it's stored, the way that that it's treated, the way that the kind of staff, you know, acknowledge this object. And I was sort of fascinated by this object in a collection being, you know, firstly that it's, you know, an innocuous little object, but also that it has all this aura around it that sort of sits outside of its objectness. So through my 3 weeks there, through research, I sort of came away with a lot of material, video material, and also, you know, like documents that sort of lent itself very much to a documentary type material. And I very much, like, I knew that that's not really where I wanted to go. I was very clear that, like, with this work, I wanted to stay away from a kind of a narration sort of voice, like the voice of God kind of approach. So the process then just became about writing a script.
Yeah.
And sort of like more around, not so much the material, like the information that I took away from the museum about this object, but more the sort of like residual things that stuck. You know, the feeling that I got from like talking to other people, and, you know, the superstitions, and I guess the things that were kind of like less tangible about the mythology around this object. So yeah, the idea of sort of writing the script in many ways was about, I guess, just sort of being able to bring some of my own, kind of like voice or creativity to the research rather than just relying purely on this like didactic information that came out of the museum.
So how did the partnership come about? How did the
So I read about this particular mirror in a book, and I thought that I just had a brief thought that was kind of interesting, because the Black Mirror has this connection to art history. Painters would use these things like back in the Renaissance to make like landscape paintings and self-portraits. But there was also like an immediate parallel history with like witchcraft and the occult.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I was just sort of interested in that relationship. So I just reached out to them and they got back, and a year or so later, I happened to be in Europe. So I just reached out to the curator that I've been communicating with, and he just said if I can get over there to come over and have a look at the object, which I did, and then sort of put together like a proposal, which they, accepted and became a partner in that project.
Great.
So going over there in 2019, I had like full access to the archive and, everything within their holdings. I got to spend time with the Black Mirror and all the like peripheral stuff that surrounds it that kind of like, protects other people from this object.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it sort of in some ways sounds like, it's one, the museum is not just also in this instance kind of carer for an object, but also protecting people from this object. So it sounds so, superstitious in some ways, even for a museum.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, the more I sort of delved into it, the more that became apparent was how, firstly there was this like layer where events that would happen around this object would add to the mythology of the object, but the museum was sort of like doing the same thing just through their ethnographic practices or lack of ethnographic practice. So for example, there's a series of drawings so the mirror was basically exorcised by a medium in the 80s, and through that exorcism a series of protective drawings were made, and the medium's instructions were they were to sit behind the glass and the backing of the mirror to kind of like stop evil spirits latching onto somebody's reflection effectively. But those drawings, those inscriptions are still held within the mirror. Whereas, if you think about archival and ethnographic practice, those drawings should be stored in, protective sleeves in like a paper section of the museum or the archive. The mirror itself should be held in like another section of the museum. But they choose to kind of keep these things together because they know that there's enough people who either work within the museum or who come to the museum as visitors who are aware of, the power of that object.
Right.
So there's like this sort of, it's kind of twofold. A lot of the curators there don't believe, or they can easily explain away the things that have happened with this mirror. But at the same time, they sort of perpetuate its mythology through the way that they treat the object.
Do you think this mirror feeds into 3 Days Without Light?
Yeah,
This
exactly.
is the film that in some ways
exactly.
is a kind of an essay around.
Yeah, I mean it's a fictionalized, scripted video work that sort of like just takes pieces of this story. And whether it's like specific to that mirror or whether some of the ideas have come more out of like Western histories around the mirror, but also bring it into more of like a contemporary context, like looking at you know, the internet, the devices that we use, which effectively become a black screen once they're idle, and the equivalency to the black mirror in the collection. And then there's also, you know, the black mirror as a term, or the term black mirror refers to, I guess, like another version of ourselves that exists online.
Yeah.
You know, you've probably all heard of the show Black Mirror. That's kind of what that references to. Yeah, so it's really just sort of taking these like little snippets of information and just stories that I'd hear from people when I was talking to them, and just bringing some of those into the script.
Yeah.
Where it didn't seem possible to do that purely through the footage that I'd gathered at the museum.
Yeah. So
I don't know why that is. I think it's just because like it was, I think there was just too much information that I brought away. And I think that like, you know, with the work that you were talking about with Octopus, that started from a really small thing, just like this started from a really small thing. And sometimes for me as an artist, it's much easier to have something really small and then you can kind of work out from that.
Yeah.
Whereas this was just too much and I couldn't take it anywhere. So I guess I just sort of let go of it and then sort of started afresh through this, script process.
Yeah, I mean, I've been, you know, I've always thought that it's, you know, I love the confidence of showing this as an install and not having the film. So you're not like navigating your way through this to get to something else is the thing. But you know, also thinking about it in quite a different way where you, you know, you have this idea and you know the outcome that you're looking for, but you know, I think it's in some ways kind of so different to the idea of a short film production where, you know, even though you're writing scripts, you know, there's so many different ways to write, to tell the story, or, you know, to tell multiple stories simultaneously. Like it's, you know, it's such a big kind of shift in kind of, you know, I think this is like a gesture that, you know, once you know you can do it, you've already had the idea, and then it's just about executing. And I think, you know, the idea of film seems to open up so many, you know, you can kind of go, I want to make a film that hinges onto this object in some ways, or you know, there's so many different ways you could tell that story.
Sure.
So, you know, how you know, working on this film, like, you know, I think, you know, there's many people that work in filmmaking and prefer a gallery context, and I'm always interested in where, you know, obviously they've got really different budgets, but, you know, why is, for you, as for your practice, you know, kind of working largely in kind of video and film, you know, why is a gallery a kind of the better context for your work rather than, you know, a cinema context or a online context?
Yeah, I think that's, particularly through lockdown, I think that's a question that sort of, you know, like I've been grappling with quite a lot. You know, one of the great things through lockdown, I think, was having access to artistic projects around the world, particularly like video, because it's so uploadable. You know, so there was a lot of access to, you know, single channel video content or reconfigured multi-channel video content to a single screen. And I think like what's been, I guess what I've been present with on this project is, I guess maybe what might differentiate this work from, you know, like a short film or a video. Because I often, because I'm working with actors and mostly people, you know, some people who come from I guess a film background, but particularly the actors, just in terms of language, it's been easier to refer to it as a short film. But I think that what I'm constantly doing throughout the process is trying to, you know, understand, you know, even if it's just mentally, like what differentiates this work from, you know, cinema or a short film. And I think it just comes back to that context of like exhibiting it, the experimentation that comes around, like the editing process.
Yeah.
But you know, like it's really important to me that the main exhibition component of the video, once it's finished, is that it's this kind of like multi-channel experience where the different screens, you know, like have a relationship to each other and to the space. And that sort of changes the way I think that I go about, you know, like filming the video. Like I'm always, you know, like I'm filming like one thing, but I'm always thinking about what the relationship to a second screen might be.
Yeah.
So that might just be about, you know, extending a cut and not turning the camera off, you know, once that scene's been shot. Or it might be getting, you know, multiple angles, so I have that opportunity to bring it into a second screen.
Yeah.
But you know, like I think with this work that at some point I will still try and put together like a single screen edit from the 2 or 3 screen final version. I think just because it makes the work like more accessible to different audiences.
Yeah.
It's not just like locked into, you know,
I
guess.
And presented in this way and
Yeah,
space
yeah,
in
and
this
something
particular way.
that I guess, you know, that then becomes something that I really want control over. You know, like if I'm in a gallery and I'm thinking about like where the screens are and when the relationship between one screen and another, that becomes something that I feel like I need to be there, and that's like almost an extension of the studio.
Yeah.
Whereas the single screen, it's just something that's kind of like transportable.
Yeah.
In a way, there's other opportunities to present the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's, you know, it's interesting, the idea of, you know, the lockdown of that suddenly more material was released, and so we did have this kind of greater access to material, and you know, it was in some ways the only way that we could see work was online. But then, you know, I think, you know, as time went on, it really made people understand how much they value, you know, the idea of being in a space and being able to kind of be present with the work.
Yeah.
You know, I know when I'm watching, when I have been watching things online, like it's really hard to kind of, you know, you're really attuned to it being, you know, on a screen this big, and that you're really attuned to all the other access to other things. And so, you know, it kind of, you know, it's in some ways kind of quite schizophrenic, because you never kind of make the space. Even when you're trying to watch something, you're trying to do all these other things at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the thing that, you know, I've really valued about kind of returning back into galleries, that, you know, in some ways it does, you know, slow you down and direct you towards thinking about one thing for a period of time. Yeah.
And I think I'm also really, you know, interested with, you know, video art is the, I guess that disruption of like a kind of I guess a traditional like A to Z linearity of like a film. You know, the way that sort of becomes, you know, determined by, you know, when somebody enters, when somebody leaves, you know, like you sort of, I guess through the editing process, I feel like I'm always in a position where, you know, every time I drop a clip in and move things around in the edit, that's a potential beginning for somebody at some point. So, you know, I guess in cinema you might have like, you know, the beautiful expansive opening shot. But almost like the way that I work in video, I sort of try to make, you know, every shot as interesting as I possibly can, because that's always the potential first thing that somebody sees.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think, you know, that's one of the things that I think is least effective about, you know, as a big fan of a lot of video works in gallery spaces, is that kind of the demand of the audience to kind of go, it takes that long, and you've got to watch it from the start, and it's so difficult to kind of navigate and keep the momentum to try and, or have the desire to even do that.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah. And I think coming back to that sort of the idea of the single edit as well, it just means that other partners that have been involved in the project, like the Museum, or I did a residency with an organisation called Enough Room for Space in Brussels, run by artist Marilyn Dijkman. It just means that there's opportunity to kind of like easily send that version out to these, you know, organisations, artists, friends, who have been really sort of involved and supportive of this project, and there's then the opportunity for them to present it in a very cost, you know, effective kind of way.
Yeah. You know, I always think it's really interesting to about how, you know, the kind of the economy of artworks in some ways, like how they're funded, what happens to them once they're made. Once you start working with you know, film crews and you know, paid actors, like, you know, what's the you know, the kind of financial underpinnings of that as for you as an artist?
The financial what, sorry?
Yeah, the underpinnings of that, like how do you finance that?
I think at this stage it's pretty much all like self-funded.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had funding for the research and development component of the partnership with Museum. But that's over. So yeah, this element is like very much self-funded, but it's also like, you know, like everyone who is involved, and there's the amazing Georgia Banks right there. You know, like the people that are involved are like so generous with their time and their knowledge and what they bring to the project as well. Yeah.
So how, and you know, I think this is going to sound gauche, but you know, it's really, and I think, you know, this came up, the idea came up when we had our electrician is called Jesus. Jesus. So, you know, and he's a lovely man, but he, you know, I think it's so confusing for people outside of the arts to kind of think about, you know, he thinks it's a great project, but he, you know,
he thought we were idiots to begin with.
He was like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
Like, and you know, what happens with it afterwards, you know, and
I was trying to sell it to Jesus, but he wouldn't buy it.
Okay. But I mean, you know, I think in some ways a lot of video work is like that as well, where it's very expensive to produce. It's kind of market outside of being shown in galleries or institutions. Outside of that, you know, it's got a limited appeal even for collectors. You know, it's one of the kind of you know, most you know, ubiquitous forms, but it's also one of the ones that has the least kind of uptake from collectors and probably even institutions.
Yeah.
So is it just like is it a money pit? You know.
Yeah. I mean. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I guess I've never really looked or thought about my art practice as something that I do to generate an income.
Yeah.
I feel like there's much easier ways to, and much more secure ways to kind of make money. But you know, I don't know. I mean, there's an interest there. There's a question, a bit like this. Is a sort of a what if. And I think for me, like the value of following that through is more rewarding than, you know, like being able to sell something and also like, you know, on the video project, the people that I've been working with, you know, like that's, you know, often like that's the reward. And for me, you know, like it's already starting to kind of like generate like ideas for new works and new methodologies. And I feel like for me, like that, I guess that inquisitive nature of being an artist and like working towards like new projects that maybe new forms or like extensions of existing forms, such as this with like working with actors, for example. I feel like for me that's sort of what drives my interest as an artist. I can't imagine my practice not being that. Not to suggest that like it would be locked into something else if it was, like if I was selling work. But I think that sort of, that inquisitiveness is what is the driver. I don't know if that answers your question. But
I mean, I think about it quite a lot because, I think it's such an important thing about, and I think Australia has quite a good infrastructure of museums and contemporary art spaces where those kind of connections are about people and they're about ideas, and it's not, commodified. But I think there's also a degree of, kind of financial sustainability that needs to be, inherent in the choices that people make to be an artist and to stay being an artist. And it's, I think everyone from the outside thinks it's such a, kind of utopian idea, but that sort of downplays the kind of a lot of the sacrifices that, the opportunity costs that people sacrifice in being an artist and staying an artist.
And I think that, like, in terms of sort of like making moving image work that might be sort of slightly outside of like an art context, I guess. I mean, this work really is extremely cheap. Like I feel like I'm working my way through this system in a way that probably shouldn't be done. Because the budgets and the people involved on those projects, it's so big. So in terms of cost, I guess I don't necessarily think about it as a what was your term, like a kind of a sinkhole or something that's just like taking up all this money, because probably in the context of things it's not. I think that where it costs money, I guess, is that there's sort of like a certain level of like kind of detail and production that I want with the work, so that it maybe sort of has one foot in this cinema space and one foot in the sort of the art world space. But I could have done that totally different. It probably doesn't need all the stuff that I'm adding to it, but that's something that's just been really important to me as a...
Will it go back to the museum in
Yeah, hopefully.
Great. Do we have any questions from our guests? Well, it's such an informal occasion. I'm sure Justin would love to address any personal inquiries in a more casual fashion at any stage across the next hours. But I would like to invite you to join me in warmly thanking Justin for his great project for one, and great generosity this afternoon.
Cool. Thanks, Mark.